The dirt in the American West does not forget. If you dig deep enough into the sun-bleached valleys of Nevada, past the sagebrush and the cracked alkali flats, you will eventually hit something hard. Sometimes it is petrified wood. Sometimes it is the jawbone of a mule that collapsed from thirst 150 years ago. But in the summer of 1879, a man named Thomas Silent Fletcher dug into the earth near the Humboldt River and found something that should not have existed. He found a chest of solid Spanish doubloons, minted in Madrid in the year 1714, buried beneath 3 feet of volcanic ash. Nevada is over 500 miles from the nearest ocean. In 1714, the Great Basin was a blank space on European maps, a region of uncharted peaks and deadly, waterless wastes known only to the Numu and Washoe tribes who watched the horizons with silent, wary eyes. How did a fortune in royal Spanish gold end up buried in a desert that no Spaniard had ever officially crossed? The answer to that question does not begin with Fletcher, nor does it end with the gold. It is a story sewn together by 3 distinct lives, separated by decades, but bound by the same terrible piece of geography. A jagged, nameless canyon that the locals eventually took to calling Dead Man's Gulch. It is a tale of a forgotten expedition, a blind mapmaker, and a young woman who wore a dead soldier's boots to survive the worst winter in American history. It is entirely true, and every piece of it left a scar on the land. Part 1. The Ghost Expedition, 1715. The heat in the valley was not merely a temperature, it was a physical weight. Captain Don Diego de Alarcón adjusted his high leather collar, which had grown stiff with salt and sweat, and looked back at his column. There were 42 men left of the 58 who had marched out of the Presidio at Santa Fe 4 months earlier. Their horses were gone, eaten or abandoned after their hooves split on the sharp volcanic rock of the high plateaus. The remaining mules were skeletal, their ribs showing through their dusty hides like the stays of a broken corset. "We are moving north of the sun," Father Bartolomeo muttered, his rosary beads clicking against his wooden staff. The Franciscan friar's lips were cracked and bleeding, his eyes bloodshot from the relentless glare of the salt flats. "The maps from the Viceroy showed rivers here, Diego. They showed the Buenaventura flowing directly to the South Sea. The Viceroy's cartographers drew those lines while sitting in a cool room in Mexico City, drinking chocolate," Diego said, his voice flat. He did not look back. If he looked back, he would see the vast, empty horizon that seemed to stretch into eternity behind them. The purpose of the Alarcón expedition was supposed to be a secret of the Spanish crown. King Philip V, newly secure on his throne after the long war of the Spanish succession, needed silver and gold to rebuild his shattered navy. Rumors had reached Santa Fe of an ancient, lost city, not Cibola, which had been proven a myth a century earlier, but a mountain of pure silver, or located far to the northwest of the Rio Grande, beyond the lands of the Ute. Diego had been given 40 soldiers, 2 priests, 16 Indian guides from the Pecos Pueblo, and 6 heavy iron-bound chests filled with royal currency to secure alliances with whatever native nations they encountered, or to buy the labor needed to open the mines. The gold was a burden. Each chest weighed over 100 pounds, strapped to the backs of the largest mules. By August, the guides had fled. They had realized what the Spaniards had not: that they were entering the Great Filtration, a land where rivers ran backward, flowing not toward the sea but inward, dissolving into bitter, muddy sinks that evaporated under the summer sun. The Pecos guides knew that to go further into the Great Basin without a guide who knew the hidden springs was a death sentence. They had vanished into the night near the Escalante Desert, leaving the Spaniards with nothing but a magnetic compass that spun erratically whenever they neared the iron-rich mountains. "Captain," called out Sergeant Ruiz from the rear, "the mule bearing the 3rd chest has collapsed. Its legs are broken." Diego stopped, The column halted behind him, the men dropping to their knees instantly, too exhausted to stand a moment longer than necessary. The air smelled of sage, dry dust, and the faint, sulphurous tang of a distant hot spring. They were in a narrow canyon now. The walls were made of a dark, red-brown basalt that absorbed the heat during the day and radiated it back out like an oven at night. It was an oppressive place, the cliffs rising 200 feet on either side, casting long, purple shadows across the canyon floor. Diego walked back to the fallen beast. The mule was on its side, its chest heaving, its large dark eyes rolling in panic. The heavy wooden box, bound with blackened iron straps and sealed with the royal wax of Spain, was tilted awkwardly against a boulder. "Can it be saved?" Diego asked. Ruiz shook his head. "No, Captain. The bone is through the skin. The animal must be killed. And the gold?" Ruiz looked around at the exhausted soldiers. Several of them were leaning against the canyon walls, their muskets held loosely, their mouths open as they tried to breathe the thin, dry mountain air. "The men cannot carry it, sir. We are already carrying 60 pounds of gear each, and our water skins are dry. If we take the gold from the mule, we must leave our ammunition." Diego looked up at the sky. A lone vulture was circling high above the rim of the canyon, a tiny black speck against the brilliant blue vault. He felt a sudden, cold premonition. This canyon was a trap. If they did not find water within 12 hours, none of them would ever see Santa Fe again. The gold, which had seemed so vital when he received his commissions from the Viceroy, now felt like nothing more than heavy rocks. "We hide it," Diego ordered. "We bury the chest here, against the eastern wall where the overhang protects the dirt from the flash floods. We will mark the location on the map, press forward to the river that the friar insists is near, and return for it when the weather cools." The soldiers dug with their swords and their bare hands. The soil was a mixture of dry clay and volcanic ash, soft enough to dig but heavy enough to exhaust them. They buried the chest 3 feet deep, placing a large, flat slab of basalt over the spot. Ruiz took his dagger and scratched a crude cross into the canyon wall above the burial site. They never came back. 3 days later, 20 miles to the north, the remnants of the Alarcón expedition stumbled into the marshy edge of what is now known as the Carson Sink. The water was thick with alkali and salt, bitter to the taste and toxic to the stomach. Dehydrated and delirious, the men drank. Within 48 hours, 40 of them were dead of dysentery and poisoning. Captain Diego de Alarcón died with his boots on, his eyes fixed on the distant, snow-capped peaks of the Sierra Nevada mountains, which promised a cool world he would never reach. Father Bartolomeo was the only survivor to return to the south, dragged across the desert by a band of nomadic Paiute, who took pity on the old man who spoke to the sky. But the friar's mind was broken by the sun. When he reached the missions of New Mexico a year later, he could only speak of a canyon of red stone where the devil guards the wealth of kings. The map he had drawn was lost in the archives of the church in Durango, buried under centuries of bureaucratic dust. The cross on the basalt wall remained, slowly wearing away as the desert wind whipped sand against the stone, year after year, decade after decade, while the United States grew from a collection of coastal colonies into a nation that looked toward the Pacific. The room in Washington, D.C. was small, damp, and smelled strongly of vinegar and whale oil lamps. Charles Fremont, no relation to the famous explorer John C. Fremont, though he claimed it whenever he needed to borrow money, stared through a massive magnifying lens at a piece of sheepskin parchment. Charles was 42, but his hair was already silver, and his eyes were failing him. Years of working by candlelight, copying maps for the U.S. Army topographical engineers, had left him with a permanent squint and a deep, burning ache behind his temples. He was a mapmaker who had never traveled further west than Ohio, yet he knew the geography of the American continent better than almost any man alive. He knew where the rivers ended. He knew where the mountains rose. And he knew that the maps the government was using to send thousands of settlers across the Oregon Trail were full of dangerous lies. "Look here, Lewis," Charles said, pointing an ink-stained finger at a spot on the parchment. His clerk, a young man named Lewis Vance, who was more interested in the theaters of New York than the geography of the wilderness, leaned over the desk. "It looks like a grease stain, Mr. Fremont." "It is not a grease stain," Charles said, his voice rising with the sharp irritation of a man who lived in his own head. "That is an archival copy of a Spanish diary from 1716. I found it in the library of the late Senator Benton. It belonged to a Franciscan priest who died in a madhouse in Mexico." He talks about a canyon 40 miles south of the Humboldt River Trail, a canyon where his expedition perished. "Many people die in the West, sir," Lewis said, checking his pocket watch. "That's why they call it the wilderness." "You don't understand," Charles whispered, his hand trembling slightly as he adjusted the lens. "The current maps show that entire region as a vast plateau, but the Spaniard describes a deep, fractured canyon system that cuts through the mountains like a knife. If that canyon exists, it means there is a low-altitude pass through the East Humboldt Range, a pass that would cut 3 weeks off the journey to California." 3 weeks, Lewis. Do you know what that means for the immigrant trains? It means they wouldn't have to race the snows of the Sierra Nevada. It means they wouldn't end up like the Hastings Party, or those poor souls who are heading out there now. Charles stood up, his spine cracking. He walked to the window, looking out at the muddy streets of Washington. The year was 1845. The phrase "manifest destiny" was on every politician's lips. The nation was dreaming of the Pacific, of the gold that people whispered was hidden in the streams of California, of the rich soil of the Willamette Valley. But Charles didn't care about the politics or the gold. He cared about the lines. To him, an unmapped space was an insult to human intelligence. It was a blank spot on the canvas of the world that needed to be filled with truth. "I am going out there," Charles announced. Lewis laughed, then stopped when he saw the expression on his employer's face. "Sir, you are a clerk. You wear spectacles that are as thick as the bottom of a cider bottle. You have a bad lung from the winter of '39. You cannot go to the Great Basin. There are Indians, wolves, and deserts that turn men's brains to ash. I have secured a position as a civilian surveyor with the Bryant Immigrant Party," Charles said coldly. "They are leaving from Independence, Missouri, in May. They need someone who can read a sextant and keep a logbook. I will find that canyon, Lewis. I will map it, and it will be called Fremont's Cutoff. My name will be on the geography books long after you are forgotten in some clerk's grave." 2 months later, Charles Fremont was sitting on the box of a Murphy wagon, his skin burning a deep, painful crimson under the Kansas sun. He had brought 3 crates of instruments. 2 English sextants, a marine chronometer hung in a velvet-lined box to protect it from the jolting of the wagon, 3 barometers for measuring altitude, and hundreds of sheets of fine, heavy rag paper. The Bryant party consisted of 24 wagons, 68 people, and over 200 head of cattle. They were typical of the era. Farmers from Illinois, blacksmiths from Ohio, families with small children who carried everything they owned in a wooden box covered by canvas. They were hopeful, ignorant, and terrified of the reports they had read in the newspapers about the savage wilderness. As the weeks turned into months, the journey changed from an adventure into an ordeal of mud, dust, and monotony. They followed the Platte River, then the Sweetwater, passing the great landmarks of the trail: Chimney Rock, Independence Rock, the high, cold wind of the South Pass. By the time they reached Fort Hall in August, the livestock were losing their shoes, and the women were burning their wooden furniture to cook their evening meals of bacon and cornmeal. It was there that Charles began to hear the stories again. An old mountain man named Pegleg Smith was sitting outside the trading post, his wooden leg extended before him, a skin of whiskey in his lap. He looked at Charles's clean wool coat and his spectacles with amused contempt. "You're that map feller, ain't ya?" Smith rasped. "I am Charles Fremont, surveyor," Charles said, drawing himself up. "I am looking for information regarding a canyon that lies south of the Humboldt Sink, a passage through the red stone cliffs." Smith spat a dark stream of tobacco juice into the dirt. "You don't want to go down there, Professor. That's Shoshone country, and even the Shoshone don't like that ditch. They call it the place of the silent stones. Nothing grows there but scorpions and bad luck. Some old French trappers went in there back in '32. Found one of 'em 3 months later up near the Oe. He'd torn his own tongue out with his fingers, so he wouldn't have to tell what he saw. I am not interested in Indian myths or trappers' tall tales," Charles said stiffly. "I am interested in the topography. Is there a water source?" "There's a creek," Smith said, his voice dropping low. "But it don't run regular. It comes up out of the rock like a flood when it rains in the mountains, and then it vanishes into the sand 5 miles down. And there's an old marker in there, a stone with a cross on it that wasn't made by no Christian man I ever met. It looks like it was cut by someone whose hand was shaking from the ague." Charles felt a thrill of recognition run through his chest. The cross. The Spanish diary had been correct. Against the advice of the wagon master, Caleb Bryant, Charles convinced 3 of the younger men in the party, brothers named John, Thomas, and Silas Miller from Indiana, to split from the main train when they reached the Humboldt River. They would take 1 light spring wagon, 6 mules, and 2 weeks of provisions to explore the canyon, while the main party continued along the standard, slower route around the northern bend of the river. "We'll meet you at the sink in 7 days," Charles told Bryant. "If I am right, this cutoff will save us 80 miles of travel through the alkali desert. We will have found the key to the Great Basin." Bryant looked out over the gray-green sea of sagebrush that stretched toward the horizon. The mountains in the distance were dark, jagged ridges that looked like the spine of a sleeping dragon. "You've got a lot of faith in lines on paper, Mr. Fremont," the wagon master said. "Out here, the only line that matters is the one between a living man and a dead one. Don't go getting them Miller boys killed for a map." On the morning of September 3, 1845, Charles Fremont and the Miller brothers turned their wagon south, away from the river trail and into the unknown hills. The first 2 days were easy. The ground rose gradually through a series of rolling sagebrush benches. The weather was unusually cool for September, the sky a pale, milky gray that kept the sun from burning Charles's sensitive eyes. He sat in the back of the moving wagon, his brass sextant in his lap, recording the altitude every 3 hours. The barometric pressure was dropping steadily, indicating that they were rising into a high mountain pass. On the 3rd day, the hills closed in. They found themselves at the entrance of a gorge that matched the Spanish description perfectly. The walls were made of a dark, reddish-brown basalt, rising in vertical steps like the ruins of some ancient, Cyclopean fortress. The floor of the canyon was covered with smooth, rounded river stones, though there was no water to be seen. It was completely silent. The wind that whistled through the sagebrush on the upper flats could not reach down into this deep trench. The only sound was the iron rims of their wagon wheels grinding against the stones, a loud, metallic clatter that echoed off the cliffs like musketry. "Don't like the look of this place," Silas Miller said, holding the reins of the mule team. He was only 19, the youngest of the brothers, and his eyes kept darting up to the rim of the canyon. "It feels like we're driving right into a grave. Look at the formations, Silas," Charles said, his face glowing with a frantic, scientific enthusiasm. "This isn't an alluvial wash. This is a tectonic fault line. The river didn't carve this. The earth tore open here. It's magnificent." They traveled deeper into the canyon. By noon, the walls were so high and close together that the light had changed from the bright glare of the desert to a strange, dim twilight. The temperature dropped 20 degrees within an hour. Then Charles saw it. He called for Silas to stop the wagon. He scrambled over the side, nearly falling into the rocks in his haste, his glasses slipping down his nose. He ran to the eastern wall of the canyon, where a massive boulder of basalt projected out from the cliff face, creating a shallow stone alcove. There, 5 feet above the canyon floor, was the mark. It was faint, worn by a century of blowing sand, but it was unmistakable. A cross, with a long vertical arm and a short, crooked horizontal bar, scratched into the dark stone with a heavy tool. Below it, almost entirely filled with gray dust, were 3 letters, ALA. "Alarcon," Charles whispered, his fingers tracing the cold grove in the rock. "He was here. The map was real. Hey, Mr. Fremont," John Miller called out from the wagon. He had walked ahead 20 yards to scout the path. "You might want to see this." Charles walked around the bend of the boulder. There, in the center of the narrow canyon, lay the wreckage of an old iron-rimmed wagon. But it was not an American immigrant wagon. The wheels were massive, thick-spoke things made of a heavy, dark wood that looked like live oak, bound with crude, hand-forged iron bands. The canvas top had long since rotted away, but the wooden bed of the wagon was partially preserved by the dry air, its timbers gray and cracked like old bones. Scattered around the wagon were the skeletons of 4 mules, their bones half buried in the sand. And there, leaning against the canyon wall, was a human skeleton. The clothes were gone, turned to rags by the wind, but the man had died wearing heavy leather boots with square copper buckles, boots that had preserved the shape of his feet long after the flesh had vanished. A rusted Spanish cavalry saber lay across his rib cage, its brass hilt still bright where it had been protected from the weather by the curve of his bones. "This isn't from our people," John Miller said, his voice hushed. "This looks like old Spanish stuff. Like the stories about the conquistadors." Charles knelt beside the skeleton. He did not feel fear. He felt an overwhelming sense of historical symmetry. He was standing on the exact spot where Spain's northernmost dream had died. "This was Sergeant Ruiz," Charles said, reading from the mental library of the documents he had memorized. "He was the one who stayed behind to guard the trail. Look here," Thomas Miller said, pointing to the wagon bed. "The floorboards have been torn up." Charles looked. The bottom of the ancient wagon had been smashed open with an axe. Inside the hidden compartment beneath the seat was nothing but dry sand and a few pieces of rotted leather strapping. "Someone was looking for something," Silas said. Suddenly, a sound echoed down the canyon. It was not the wind. It was a sharp, cracking sound, like a pistol shot, followed by a low, rumbling vibration that shook the stones beneath their feet. Charles looked up. The sky through the narrow slit of the canyon walls had turned from gray to a deep, bruised purple. A drop of water, large, cold, and heavy, struck him directly in the center of his spectacles, blurring his vision. "Storm in the mountains," John Miller shouted, his face turning pale. "The water's coming!" In the Great Basin, a storm 20 miles away can turn a dry canyon into a raging torrent 30 feet deep within minutes. The baked earth cannot absorb the rain. The water runs off the rocky peaks into the narrow gorges, accumulating volume and speed until it becomes a wall of liquid mud, boulders, and trees moving at 30 miles an hour. "Turn the wagon!" Charles screamed. "Get out of the canyon!" But it was too late. The canyon was too narrow for the long team of mules to turn. Silas tried to back them up, but the terrified animals reared, their hooves striking the rocks, their harnesses tangling in a frantic mess of leather and iron. A sound like a coming train filled the gorge. It was a roar that grew louder with every second, a deep, bass thrumming that vibrated in the teeth of the men. "Run!" John Miller yelled, abandoning the wagon and scrambling up the steep, loose shale of the canyon wall. Thomas followed him, his boots sliding on the treacherous rock. Silas stayed a second longer, trying to cut the mules loose with his pocket knife, but his brother grabbed his coat and dragged him up the slope just as the first wave of water came around the bend. It was not clear water. It was a black, roiling wall of liquid earth, 10 feet high, carrying with it the trunks of dead mountain mahogany trees, old sagebrush bushes, and boulders the size of barrels. It struck the Miller brothers' wagon with a sound like a house collapsing. The heavy wooden vehicle was lifted instantly into the air, its wheels spinning, before it was slammed against the basalt cliff and reduced to splinters. The mules disappeared beneath the black foam without a sound. Charles Fremont did not run up the wall. His old legs were too stiff, his vision too poor in the dim light. Instead, he lunged into the shallow alcove beneath the boulder where the Spanish cross was carved. He squeezed his body into the narrow crack between the boulder and the cliff face, pressing his chest against the stone, his fingers gripping the carved groove of the cross. The water struck. It rose past his knees, then his waist, cold as ice, pulling at his wool coat with a terrible, heavy suction. The force of the current was immense. It felt like a dozen men were grasping his legs, trying to drag him down into the dark torrent. He lost his spectacles. The world became a blurred, roaring chaos of gray water and dark stone. He held onto the cross. He closed his eyes and prayed to the God of the mapmakers, the God who measured the world with a compass, to let him survive long enough to draw this one last line. The peak of the flash flood lasted less than 5 minutes. The water subsided as quickly as it had come, leaving behind a thick layer of slick, gray mud and a smell of ancient, stagnant earth that had been dug up from the deep mountain roots. When the Miller brothers climbed down from the cliffs, they found Charles still wedged into the stone crack. His clothes were torn to shreds, his face was bruised and covered in mud, and his eyes were wide and sightless without his glasses. But his hands were still locked around the basalt boulder. His crates of instruments were gone. His sextants were at the bottom of the Carson sink, buried under 10 feet of silt. His beautiful, expensive rag paper was mush. The logs he had kept for 3 months were destroyed. They survived the 40-mile walk back to the main trail by drinking water from the muddy potholes left by the storm. When they reached the Bryant party, Charles was delirious with fever. He spent the rest of the journey to California lying in the back of a strange wagon, his lips moving silently as he drew invisible maps with his finger on the canvas ceiling. He died 3 years later in a boarding house in Sacramento, a blind beggar who told anyone who would buy him a glass of port that he had found the shortcut to the Empire of Spain, but that the river had stolen his eyes, so he could never find his way back. The year 1862 was a time of water and blood in the West. While the states of the East were tearing each other apart at Antietam and Shiloh, California and Nevada were experiencing a catastrophe of a different kind, the Great Flood. For 40 days and 40 nights, beginning in December 1861, it rained without interruption across the entire Pacific coast. It was an atmospheric river of tropical moisture that melted the massive snowpacks of the Sierra Nevada, turning the Central Valley of California into an inland sea 20 feet deep and turning the rivers of Nevada into raging monsters that swallowed whole towns. In the midst of this deluge, a small immigrant train found itself trapped on the eastern slopes of the Stillwater Range. They were late-season travelers, families who had been delayed by Indian raids along the Sweetwater, and who had tried to take a southern route to avoid the deep winter snows of the high passes. Among them was Mary Ann Crane, a 21-year-old woman from Iowa. Mary Ann was not a typical pioneer woman. She was the daughter of a village watchmaker, a girl who had grown up surrounded by gears, springs, and precision instruments. She could fix a grandfather clock with a hairpin and read the stars with a brass astrolabe her father had brought from England. Her husband, George Crane, a young carpenter who had dreamed of building hotels in Virginia City, had died of mountain fever 3 weeks earlier near Fort Churchill, leaving Mary, and with nothing but a light spring wagon, a pair of worn-out oxen, and her father's old mahogany toolbox. By January, the oxen were dead, their meat dried into tough, flavorless jerky that Mary Ann rationed out to herself and the 3 children of her sister, who had also perished on the trail. The remnants of the wagon train had broken up into small, desperate camps, scattered along the ridges above the floodwaters. Mary Ann was alone in her wagon, which she had propped up on logs after the wheels had rotted through from the constant dampness. The world had shrunk to a circle of gray mist, freezing rain, and the constant, dull roar of the water rushing through the canyons below. "Aunt Mary," called out 7-year-old Toby from beneath a pile of wet quilts in the wagon bed. "The water's coming into the box again." Mary Ann stood up from her seat. She was wearing a heavy wool coat that had belonged to a Union soldier who had died at Fort Ruby, its brass buttons green with corrosion. Her feet were wrapped in rags and pieces of old canvas, tied with hemp rope. Her own leather shoes had fallen apart weeks ago. "Keep the blankets over your sisters, Toby," she said, her voice steady despite the cold that seemed to have settled into her marrow. "I'm going to look for firewood." There was no firewood. Every piece of sagebrush within a mile had been soaked through by the rain or carried away by the mudslides. The only things that would burn were the dry inner timbers of the abandoned wagons that sat along the ridge like the ribs of dead whales. Mary Ann took her father's heavy iron adze from the toolbox and walked out into the downpour. The mud was thick and gray, like liquid mortar, pulling at her wrapped feet with every step. She walked down the slope of the ridge toward a deep, narrow canyon that she had avoided until now. It was a dark, forbidding place where the red stone cliffs rose vertically into the mist, the place the Teamsters called Dead Man's Gulch. She knew the history of the place. Everyone on the trail knew it. It was where the Fremont Party had been wiped out 17 years earlier, and where people said the spirits of old Spanish soldiers walked when the storm was high. But Mary Ann did not care about spirits. She cared about dry wood. She knew that beneath the overhanging cliffs of the canyon, there might be old mountain mahogany logs that had remained dry through the 40 days of rain. She scrambled down the slick shale path into the gorge. The air inside was cold and heavy with the smell of wet clay and sulfur. The floor of the canyon was a chaotic mess of boulders and old debris that had been brought down by the recent floods. The water in the central creek was a rushing, brown torrent, 3 feet deep, throwing up a gray foam as it broke against the rocks. As she walked along the eastern wall, looking for dry brush beneath the overhangs, her foot struck something metallic. It was a sharp, ringing sound that didn't belong in the desert. She stopped, wiping the rain from her eyes, and looked down. Protruding from a fresh mudslide that had been washed down from the upper cliffs was a large, flat slab of basalt stone. The force of the rain had cleared away the silt that had covered it for nearly 2 centuries. And there, exposed to the light of 1862, was an iron band. Mary Ann knelt in the mud. She cleared away the wet earth with her bare hands, her fingernails breaking against the gravel. It was a box. A heavy, rectangular chest made of a dark wood that she recognized instantly as European oak, wood that was not native to the American West. The box was bound with thick straps of hand-forged iron that had turned a dark, flaky orange with rust, but the lock mechanism was still intact, protected by a heavy bronze plate shaped like the double-headed eagle of the House of Habsburg. She recognized the seal. Her father had once repaired an old clock that had come from the palace of the Spanish governor in New Orleans, and it had borne that same eagle. The Spanish gold, she whispered to herself. She looked around the empty canyon. The rain was still falling, a steady, whispering hiss against the stone walls. There was no one there. The other immigrants were shivering in their tents miles away, too weak to move, waiting for the government-supply trains that everyone knew would never arrive through the flooded passes. Mary, and took her father's iron adze. She raised it over her shoulder and brought it down with all her strength against the rusted iron lock of the chest. The sound of the blow echoed off the basalt cliffs like a rifle shot. The adze bounced off the bronze plate, leaving nothing but a bright scratch. The iron was old, but it was thick, case-hardened by some blacksmith who had worked his bellows in Toledo 150 years ago. She struck it again, and again. She worked with a frantic, desperate energy, her hands turning red and raw from the cold iron handle, her breath coming in ragged gasps. She was not thinking about wealth. She was thinking about her father's shop, about the price of flour in San Francisco, about the 3 children who were shivering under wet quilts in her wagon. On the 7th blow, the ancient iron strap snapped with a sharp crack. The bronze plate tilted, its old screws tearing out of the rotted oak wood behind it. Mary and wedged the flat blade of the adze beneath the lid and pried upward. The wood groaned, then split down the center with a sound like a dry branch breaking. The lid flew back. Inside, the chest was filled with hundreds of small, heavy canvas bags. The fabric of the bags had long since rotted into a gray, cobweb-like dust, but the contents had not changed. They had remained pristine, impervious to the rain, the mud, and the passage of time. They were gold doubloons, thousands of them. They were thick, irregularly shaped coins, stamped with the cross of Jerusalem and the coat of arms of Spain. They caught the dim, gray light of the storm, glowing with a dull, heavy yellow that seemed to absorb the dampness of the air. Marian reached out and picked up a handful of the coins. They were heavy, far heavier than the American gold eagle she had seen in Missouri. They felt greasy to the touch, the unique texture of pure gold that has been buried in the dark for generations. She didn't scream. She didn't jump for joy. She sat back on her heels in the gray mud, her hands full of royal treasure, and began to laugh, a low, quiet laugh that quickly turned into a sob. "Gold," she whispered. "We have all the gold in the world, and we're going to starve to death in a ditch." She knew she couldn't carry the chest. It weighed more than she did, and the mud would swallow her if she tried to drag it. She couldn't tell the others in the camp. If she did, the men would turn into animals, fighting over the coins with knives and axes, while the children died of the cold. She filled the deep pockets of her Union soldier's coat until the wool tore from the weight. She stuffed coins into the canvas wrappings of her feet, lining her soles with the gold of King Philip V, so that she was literally walking on a fortune. She took nearly 40 pounds of the gold, worth perhaps $10,000 in 1862, an unimaginable sum for a pioneer woman, and covered the rest of the chest with the basalt slab and the loose gray shale of the mudslide. She climbed back up the ridge, her feet heavy and clanking with every step, like an iron-shod mule. The gold saved them, but not in the way she had expected. 2 days later, a party of 5 men rode into the camp. They were not rescuers. They were a group of rogue secessionist guerrillas from Virginia City. Men who had deserted from the California Volunteers and were heading east to join the Confederate forces in Texas. They were well armed, well mounted, and desperate for provisions. The leader of the group, a man named Henderson who wore a black plume in his hat and carried 2 Colt revolvers in his belt, walked into Mary Ann's wagon. He looked at the 3 starving children and the old watchmaker's tools with a cold, predatory eye. "We're taking your mules, ma'am," Henderson said, his hand resting on the butt of his pistol. "And whatever flour you've got left. The Confederate States of America require your contribution to the cause." "The mules are dead," Marion said, sitting on her toolbox. She looked him directly in the eye, her face as cold as the rain outside. "And the flour was gone a week ago. If you take what little jerky we have left, these children will be dead by Sunday." "That's a pity," Henderson said, turning toward the wagon door. "But war is a hard business." "Wait," Marion said. She reached down, untied the canvas rags from her right foot, and pulled out a handful of the heavy, yellow coins. She dropped them onto the wooden lid of the toolbox. They landed with a heavy, dull thud that caused Henderson to stop in his tracks. He turned around, his eyes expanding until the whites showed all around the pupils. He walked back to the box, picked up one of the doubloons, and bit it with his yellow teeth. "Where did you get this?" he whispered, his voice trembling with a sudden, sharp greed. "This is old Spanish gold. This is bullion. There isn't old cash," Marion said, her voice steady and calculating. "A Spanish wagon that was buried in the gulch during the Great Storm 17 years ago. I found it while looking for wood. There are 5 more chests like this one, buried under the stone." Henderson lunged forward, grabbing her by the collar of her coat. "Show me where it is." "I will show you nothing," Marion said, not flinching from his grip, "unless you give me 3 of your horses, 2 sacks of parched corn, and your promise on your mother's grave that you will escort this wagon train to the Valley Settlement at Dayton. If you refuse, you can shoot me, but you will never find that stone. The mud has covered it, and the canyon is a mile long." Henderson stared at her. He was a killer, a thief, and a traitor, but he was also a man of the West, and he knew when he had met his match. He looked at the gold on the box, then at the silent, determined woman who wore a dead soldier's coat and had gold in her shoes. "You're a hard woman, Mrs. Crane," he said, releasing her collar. "It's a hard country, Mr. Henderson," she replied. The bargain was struck. Henderson and his men were villains, but they were efficient ones. They brought 2 of their pack horses and hitched them to Mary Ann's wagon. They shared their dried beef and corn with the camp, and for 4 days they guarded the small caravan as it crawled down the muddy slopes of the Stillwater Range into the Carson Valley. When they reached the canyon entrance, Mary Ann pointed to a spot on the western wall, far away from the actual burial site. "It's down there," she said, "under the 3rd red slide." Henderson and his men didn't wait to say goodbye. They turned their horses and galloped into the gorge, their shovels clattering against their saddles, their hearts full of the ancient, poisonous dream of Spain. Mary Ann never saw them again. The newspaper in Virginia City reported a month later that 3 men had been caught in a cave-in inside Dead Man's Gulch during the February rains, their bodies crushed beneath 50 tons of basalt rock. Whether it was Henderson's party or some other unfortunate miners, the paper did not say. Mary had taken her 40 pounds of gold to Dayton, where she sold it to a German banker for $8,000 in legal tender. She bought a small house, sent her nephew and nieces to school, and opened a shop where she repaired watches and marine chronometers for the miners of the Comstock Lode. She lived to be 84, a quiet, respected woman who never married again and who never, under any circumstances, went out into the rain without her leather boots. Thomas, Silent, Fletcher earned his nickname because he had lost his tongue to a Minnie ball at the Battle of the Wilderness in 1864. He was 50 years old, a solitary prospector who lived in a stone dugout near the Humboldt Sink, his only companion an old blue-ticked hound that had lost one ear to a coyote. Thomas didn't care about history. He didn't know about Captain Alarcon, or Charles Fremont, or Marion Crane. He cared about one thing, the color. For 10 years, he had been working the old, abandoned placer claims along the edges of the desert, washing the sand in a tin pan, looking for the tiny, yellow flakes that meant a man could buy a sack of flour and a bottle of rye whiskey at the end of the month. He was a survivor of the Great Rush, one of the thousands of men who had come west to get rich and had stayed behind to become part of the scenery, as gray and dry as the sagebrush itself. On a July afternoon in 1879, the heat was so great that even the grasshoppers had stopped clicking. The sky was an intense, metallic white, and the air felt like it had been blown through a blacksmith's forge. Thomas was working a small, unnamed wash that cut into the eastern side of Dead Man's Gulch. The canyon had changed over the years. The great floods of 62 and 75 had carved new channels through the basalt, exposing old layers of earth that had been sealed for centuries. He was digging with a short-handled shovel into a bank of gray, powdery volcanic ash that sat beneath a massive ledge of red stone. It was a stupid place to dig. There was no water to wash the dirt, and the ash was so light that it got into a man's lungs and made him cough blood. But Thomas had noticed a thin line of black sand, heavy iron, or running through the ash, and where there is black sand, there is often gold. His shovel hit something hard. It was not the sharp tink of iron against basalt. It was a dull, heavy thud, like an axe striking a green log. Thomas knelt in the dust. He used his fingers, which were as thick and callous as pieces of harness leather, to clear away the ash. He found a piece of wood. It was black, heavy, and split down the center, its grain filled with fine, white dust. Attached to the wood was a strip of rusted iron, held in place by a single, square-headed copper nail. He dug deeper. Within an hour, he had uncovered the remains of a heavy wooden chest. The top had been smashed open long ago. The wood was splintered and scarred by the blows of an adze, and the interior was filled with dry sand and the skeletal remains of several small leather bags. But the chest was not empty. In the bottom corner, protected by a double thickness of oak timber that had not rotted, lay a pile of coins. They were not scattered. They were still stacked in neat, heavy rows, held together by the gray crust of the volcanic soil. Thomas picked up one of the coins. He wiped the ash away on his sleeve. It was a Spanish doubloon, dated 1714. He didn't make a sound. He couldn't. He sat there in the blinding heat, his old dog leaning against his knee, looking at the wealth of an empire that had vanished before his own grandfather was born. He knew what it was. Every prospector in Nevada had heard the story of the lost Spanish mine, the ghost expedition that had left its gold in the Red Canyon. Most men thought it was a lie, a yarn spun by old-timers over the saloon stoves to get a free drink from greenhorns. But Thomas held the proof in his hand. He didn't take the gold to Virginia City. He didn't go to San Francisco to live in a palace with velvet curtains. He was too old for that, and the desert had become his home. He knew that if he brought the gold into a bank, the lawyers would come, the government would take its share, and his quiet life would be over. Instead, Thomas Fletcher did something that only a man who had forgotten the sound of his own voice could do. He left the gold where it was. He took 5 coins. Just enough to buy a new mule, a 2-ounce tin of premium tobacco, and a pair of good spectacles for his failing eyes. He replaced the flat basalt slab over the broken chest, shoveled the gray volcanic ash back into the hole until the bank looked exactly as it had for 100 years, and walked back to his dugout. Every summer for the next 12 years, until his death in the winter of 1891, Thomas would walk into the canyon on the hottest day of the year, when the sun was too bright for anyone else to be on the trail. He would dig up the chest, take out 5 doubloons, and bury it again. He used the gold to buy his silence, his independence, and his peace. When the county coroner found Thomas's body in his dugout after a 3-day blizzard, they found nothing under his mattress but an old, water-damaged map drawn by a blind man named Charles Fremont, which Thomas had bought for a quarter at an auction in Sacramento 20 years before. The map showed a line running through a red stone canyon, labeled in faint, elegant script, the cutoff to the kingdom. The gold itself is still there. The hills of Nevada have shifted since 1879. Earthquakes have dropped the canyon walls, and the great construction of the Southern Pacific Railroad in the early 20th century buried the old wash under millions of tons of blasted rock. Dead Man's Gulch is gone from the modern maps, its name replaced by a number on a highway surveyor's chart. But if you stand on the high ridge above the Humboldt Sink when the summer storm is rising from the south, and you look toward the red cliffs where the sagebrush doesn't grow, you can still feel the weight of that canyon. It is a place where 3 nations met, where 3 lives were broken, and where the gold of Spain still rests in the dark, waiting for the next man with a shovel and a line on a piece of paper. The world that Thomas Fletcher left behind did not stay quiet for long. By the turn of the 20th century, the American West was no longer a blank space on a map or a dangerous crossing for wagon trains. It was a grid of steel rails, copper telegraph wires, and concrete irrigation canals. The great silence of the Great Basin was broken by the whistle of the Southern Pacific locomotives and the roar of stamp mills in the mountains. In the autumn of 1922, a young civil engineer named Arthur Vance was sitting in a makeshift office inside a canvas tent, 10 miles north of the fading ghost town of Dayton, Nevada. Arthur was 26, a veteran of the Great War in Europe, where he had spent 2 years in the muddy trenches of France mapping artillery coordinates for the U.S. Army. He was a man of the new century. He wore laced leather boots, riding breeches, and a white canvas cap, and he believed in the absolute power of machinery to tame the earth. He was the great-grandson of Louis Vance, the Washington clerk who had once laughed at a blind mapmaker named Charles Fremont. Arthur did not know this connection. Family histories, like the gold of Spain, have a way of getting buried under the dust of generations. Arthur's job was to survey the route for State Route 40, a new gravel highway designed to connect the ranching towns of central Nevada with the growing cities of California. It was the precursor to what would eventually become Interstate 80. The grade is too steep through the northern ridge, his assistant, a young Nevadan named Roy, said, throwing a bundle of blue blueprints onto the wooden drafting table. If we follow the old Pioneer Trail around the bend, the state will have to pay for 3 extra miles of grading through the basalt. The governor wants this road straight, Art. Straight and cheap. Arthur adjusted his brass transit level, looking through the telescope toward the dark, jagged ridges of the Stillwater Range. The afternoon sun was low, casting long, ink-black shadows across the desert floor. There's a break in the cliffs 5 miles south, Arthur said, pointing a pencil toward a narrow, purple cleft in the mountain wall. Look at the topography on the old geological survey. There's an old wash down there. It's not named on the modern maps, but the old-timers call it the Gulch. Dead Man's Gulch, Roy said, stepping into the tent to escape the rising evening wind. You don't want to take the steam shovels in there, Chief. That place is a geological mess. The rock is loose basalt and volcanic ash. If we blast in there, the whole mountain is liable to come down on the steam shovels. It's a graveyard. The steam shovel doesn't care about ghosts, Roy, Arthur said with the easy confidence of a man who had seen the hills of Verdun blasted into Swiss cheese by heavy artillery. We'll take a crew down there tomorrow with the diamond drills. If the bedrock is solid beneath the wash, we can cut a 60-foot right-of-way through the canyon and save the state $40,000 in concrete work. The next morning, the silence of Dead Man's Gulch was shattered forever. Two massive Bucyrus steam shovels, their black boilers belching thick, greasy coal smoke into the clear desert sky, crawled into the mouth of the canyon like iron monsters from another planet. Behind them came a crew of 30 men, mostly Italian and Greek immigrants, who had worked the copper mines of Ely, carrying boxes of DuPont dynamite, iron drill steels, and heavy sledgehammers. Arthur stood on a boulder near the eastern wall of the canyon, his notebook open, recording the depth of the alluvial gravel. The canyon had changed since the days of Mary and Crane and Thomas Fletcher. A minor earthquake in 1915 had caused a massive section of the western wall to collapse, filling the center of the gorge with a chaotic jumble of white clay and red rock. The creek was entirely gone, buried beneath 20 feet of ancient debris. Set the first line of holes along that lower ledge, Arthur ordered the foreman, a burly man named Mike. We need to widen the floor by 15 feet before the steam shovels can begin digging the roadbed. Mike spat a stream of tobacco juice against the dark stone wall. That rock's funny, Mr. Vance. Look at it. It ain't regular basalt. It's soft in places, like old clay, and then you hit a spot that's as hard as anvil iron. And look here. Mike pointed his thick finger at a section of the cliff face, 5 feet above the rubble. The wind and the rain of 2 centuries had done their work, but the rock had preserved its secret. There, half obliterated by a long fracture in the stone, was a faint, crooked cross. Below it, the letters ALA were no longer visible, but the shape of the stone alcove, the exact spot where Charles Fremont had clung for his life during the flash flood of 1845, remained like a hollow tooth in the mountain's jaw. Arthur walked over and looked at the mark. He traced the groove with his finger, feeling the coldness of the stone. To his modern, engineering mind, it looked like an old boundary marker, perhaps from the early cattle ranches of the 1870s. An old mining claim, probably, Arthur said, turning away. It doesn't matter. The right-of-way goes right through it. Drill it out. For 3 hours, the canyon filled with a deafening, rhythmic clink-clink-clink of hand drills striking steel, followed by the deep, mechanical chugging of the steam shovels as they began to clear the loose shale from the canyon floor. The bucket of the largest shovel, fitted with 4 massive manganese steel teeth, plunged into the bank of gray volcanic ash near the eastern wall, the very bank where Thomas Fletcher had dug his 5 doubloons every summer. The operator of the shovel, a man named Henderson, no relation to the guerrilla leader of 1862, though the name seemed to haunt the soil, pulled the heavy iron levers. The boiler hissed, the steel cables groaned, and the massive bucket tore into the earth, lifting 3 tons of gray ash and gravel into the air. As the bucket swung toward the dump truck, something bright caught the glare of the noon sun. It was not a rock. It was a flash of brilliant, metallic yellow that did not belong in the gray dirt of Nevada. "Hold it!" Arthur shouted, waving his canvas cap frantically at the operator. "Stop the engine!" The shovel stopped, its heavy bucket dangling 10 feet above the ground, a thin stream of gray dust sifting through the steel teeth. Arthur ran forward, his boots sinking into the loose, freshly turned earth. He climbed into the bed of the dump truck where the first load of ash had been deposited. He knelt in the dirt, his heart hammering against his ribs with a sudden, primitive excitement that every man in the West understood, no matter how civil or educated he claimed to be. He reached into the dirt and pulled out a heavy, flat object. It was a piece of iron-bound wood, black as coal and rotted to the consistency of cork. But sticking to the wood, welded together by 200 years of pressure and dampness, were dozens of thick, heavy gold coins. "What is it, Chief?" Roy asked, scrambling up the side of the truck, his eyes wide. "Did we hit a pocket? Is it a vein?" Arthur didn't answer. He used his pocket knife to scrape the gray crust from one of the coins. The dirt fell away, revealing the bold, elegant cross of Jerusalem and the words that had been stamped in the Royal Mint of Madrid, while the American continent was still a wilderness. Philippus VD. G. Hispaniarum Rex. "It's not a vein," Arthur whispered, his voice trembling as he looked down at the handful of treasure. "It's an old chest. A Spanish chest." Within minutes, the road crew had abandoned their tools. The discipline of the engineering camp dissolved into a frantic, chaotic scramble as 30 men fell to their knees in the gray ash, digging with their bare hands, their pocket knives, and their hats. They found the remnants of the Alarcón treasure. But they did not find the thousands of doubloons that Mary and Crane had seen in 1862. They found what was left after the floods, the landslides, and the silent extractions of Thomas Fletcher. They found 84 gold doubloons, 6 silver shoe buckles, a rusted Spanish dagger with a silver wire-wrapped hilt, and 2 heavy iron hinges that had once secured the lid of the king's chest. The men fought over the coins until Arthur restored order with his service revolver, firing 2 shots into the air to stop a knife fight between 2 drillers. The gold was collected into a wooden dynamite box, sealed with wax, and delivered to the state bank in Reno 3 days later under an armed guard of the Nevada State Police. The discovery was a 7-day wonder in the newspapers. The Reno Evening Gazette ran a banner headline, "Conquistador Gold Found in Stillwater Canyon." Writers from San Francisco and New York wrote long, romantic stories about the Lost Alarcón expedition, inventing tales of beautiful Spanish princesses and Indian massacres that had never happened. But the gold itself was soon lost again, swallowed by the great machinery of modern law. The state of Nevada claimed the coins under an old salvage statute. The descendants of the Bryant Wagon Party filed a lawsuit claiming the gold belonged to the heirs of Charles Fremont. And a lawyer representing a mysterious Spanish Historical Society in Buenos Aires sent a series of long, legal telegrams to Washington that were eventually filed in a basement archive and forgotten. The coins were placed in a velvet-lined case in the basement of the state capitol building in Carson City, where they sat for 40 years, their bright yellow faces slowly dulling under the electric lights, seen only by school children on field trips and janitors who swept the floors at night. By the year 2026, the highway through Dead Man's Gulch had been abandoned for over half a century. A newer, wider 4-lane interstate had been built 3 miles to the north, cutting through the mountains with massive concrete tunnels and bypasses that made the old canyon road obsolete. The asphalt of State Route 40 had cracked and split under the relentless Nevada sun, the sagebrush growing up through the fissures until the road looked like nothing more than a gray deer trail winding through the hills. The canyon had returned to its original state, silent, hot, and empty. The descendants of those who had crossed the canyon were scattered across the face of the nation. Mary Ann Crane's great-great-granddaughter was a professor of geology at the University of Nevada in Reno. She kept a small, worn gold coin on her desk, used as a paperweight to hold down maps of the Great Basin's underground water tables. She knew the family story, the tale of the woman who wore gold in her shoes. But to her, the true wonder was not the wealth, but the water. "The Great Basin is a closed system," she told her students during a lecture on Western hydrology. "Every drop of rain that falls between the Sierra Nevada and the Wasatch Mountains never reaches the sea. It flows inward. It sinks into the sand. It fills the alkali flats. It evaporates into the sky, or it hides in the deep, volcanic faults beneath the stone. It is a land that holds on to everything it receives. It is a place where nothing is ever truly lost. It is simply filtered down into the dark. And that is the ultimate truth of Dead Man's Gulch. If you go out there today, past the abandoned highway and the rusted skeletons of old 1920s cars that sit in the ravines, you can still find the spot where the canyon narrows. The red basalt walls still rise 200 feet into the blue sky, their stone faces scarred by the drill holes of Arthur Vance's crew and the ancient scratches of Captain Alarcon's men. The earth has reclaimed its own. The gold is gone, or perhaps it is not. Geologists say that the 1915 earthquake did not open the entire canyon floor. It merely shifted the upper layers of shale. Deep within the bedrock, 60 feet below the abandoned asphalt of the old highway, where the water from the mountain snows still flows through the dark, iron-rich fissures of the fault line, there may be other chests. There may be the bones of the mules that Ruiz killed, the brass spectacles of Charles Fremont, and the lost sabers of the soldiers of King Philip V. The desert does not care about the value men place on yellow metal or lines drawn on sheepskin paper. It only cares about the balance. The wind still whips the sand against the red stone cliffs, slowly erasing the drill marks, the tire tracks, and the memories of the people who thought they could conquer the wilderness. The sun goes down behind the Sierra, casting a long, purple shadow across the Humboldt Sink, and the canyon grows cold. The sagebrush smells of old rain, and the silent stones remain where they have always been, guarding the secrets of the American West beneath 3 feet of ash, 500 miles from the sea, where the rivers run backward and the stories never truly end.